As 1913 rolled over into 1914, Thomas Gibbs was serving with the 3rd Special Reserve Battalion of the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry. The Special Reserve were not regular soldiers, they were civilians, but unlike the Territorial Force, who met up one night a week and went to a couple of camps a year, the Special Reserve had an intensive period of training once a year and had much better equipment than the Territorial Force. In fact, they were very closely aligned to the regular army, with the intention that on the outbreak of war, they could very quickly be assimilated into regular units and go straight off to the front. However, on the 9th of January 1914, Thomas decided he fancied a change and he enlisted into the regular army. In fact, he fancied a real change because he enlisted into the 12th Lancers. Now, we know that Thomas didn't go off to war in 1914 or even 1915 because he was only awarded the British War Medal and the Victory Medal. So that means he could only have gone overseas after January the 1st, 1916. However, we do know that he was definitely serving somewhere in 1915, almost certainly at home, because he, along with many other men of the 12th Lancers, was presented this rather natty little penknife by Lady Alice Verner for Christmas 1915. And actually on the back it says 12th Lancers number 139, which isn't his service number, but the assumption is that these were all numbered. There was a batch of them. And it has all sorts of gadgets and gizmos, which are very handy for soldiers doing whatever they do, and including some bits and pieces that we weren't even sure what they were or what they do. However, this was typical of the sort of thing that was happening at the time. There were all sorts of great and good, having presents made for specific units, wallets, knives, pipes, goodness knows what else, way outside all of the other Christmas funds. Certainly not on the same scale that there had been in 1914, but it was still nice to see that the soldiers were still being thought of by people in Christmas 1915 and beyond. However, what I'd really like to look at is his helmet, because at the end of the war, one of the souvenirs that Tom Gibbs brought home was this steel shrapnel helmet. It's the earliest version, it's what we call the rimless version, so it hasn't got the turned over rim around the edge. And the chin strap, instead of being the one-piece chin strap which runs all the way round like the later helmets with an integral buckle, it's the early style with the 2 separate pieces. So this is the very first type that was issued on a wide scale. Steel helmets start to appear towards the end of 1915. Originally they're a trench store, they're given to runners and machine gunners and people who are sort of out in the open a bit more often and didn't have the opportunity to shelter as much as the others. But by the May of 1916, they were issued to pretty much every soldier in the front line in a place where their life was in danger. And the army orders were very specific. You had to wear your helmet if you'd been issued with one, because if you then got a head wound because you weren't wearing your helmet, well, that was negligence on your part and you would be punished for it, on top of getting a head wound. In their original form, they had a very unusual sort of liner, very different to the type that was issued later. Sadly, Thomas's helmet is missing its liner, which was a very common thing to happen. The rivet in the top there, very often the brass rivet would just shear off and the liners would fall out. And it was very common to see fellas actually wearing the liner as a little hat in its own right, and then just plonk the helmet on top and do the chin strap up. But with such a floppy single rivet, it's not surprising that many helmets lost their liners, and so sadly we don't have that for Thomas's helmet. But it's rather lovely because it does still retain its original Hessian cover, which, as you can imagine, was something that after the war, if they'd got quite battered, even fellas that kept their helmets would very often take the covers off. And actually by 1918, the covers start to disappear, because the covers were introduced originally because the helmets have a very distinctive outline, which were very popular with German snipers. And also, in their original form, they were painted a sort of an apple green colour, and they were very shiny. So soldiers would cover them in mud to tone them down. In fact, in General Jack's diary, he talks about exactly that. Going into the line, smearing them with mud, coming out of the line, having to scrub them all clean again because you had to be smart and tidy, and then having to cover them in mud when you went back in. So the solution was to cover the helmets with Hessian covers or khaki drill covers to break up the shape and to stop the shine. By 1918, certainly by the advance in the last 100 days, helmet covers, even though they are still around, they start disappearing because the purpose that they were invented for, that breaking up the shape in trench warfare, had become a thing of the past in that big war of movement. We know that Tom Gibbs took part in the fighting right until the end of the war because his paybook is actually signed by his troop commander in 1919 when he's in Cologne as part of the Army of Occupation. So he survived the war, and after the war he was still attending old comrades' reunions for the 12th Lancers right the way up until 1939 when the Second World War broke out. So just a nice example of a souvenir that he brought home, and obviously he'd kept his 1915 Christmas gift from Lady Verna. But just nice to see something like this that has survived pretty much untouched just as he brought it home.